I gotta stop the song. That's Shuva by Zusha. Such a good song. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? Slide up the darkness. Who is with us as we gather to do a double daf, a double page here on a Monday? Stephen in New Hampshire, Yehud in South Carolina, Pauline in Arkansas, James in Indianapolis, Patrice in Utah, Belle in Texas, Hannah in New York, Bill in mid-Missouri, Stephen in Oklahoma, Paul in the Great Northwest, Nancy, North Carolina, Renee in Indiana, Christo in Lubbock, Guy in Dayton, Ohio, Lucy in Minnesota, Dorothy in Pennsylvania, Melissa in Great Neck, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey, saved by a miracle today when my car was hit, rolled over, oh my God, Sharon, rolled over and into a median, much to the shock of the EMTs. I got away with little obvious injury. Baruch Hashem. Baruch Hashem. Wow, Sharon. Thank God you're okay. Thank you for sharing that experience with us. And, you know, thank God. Thank God. I'm so so happy to hear these news. Baruch Hashem. Christo, too bad double daf day isn't a hashtag yet. Josh Gray in upstate New York. Welcome, everybody. Over on the YouTube side, Aoife in Florida. Okay, lots to do today because it's a double page. All I'll say about yesterday, we went to the funeral of that girl that I mentioned last week who succumbed to suicide. What can one say? You know, it was good to be together as a community in such a terrible, terrible time. And thank God for the rituals of Shiva and of funeral and of community gathering at such difficult times to support the family. It's just awful, but I will just reiterate, we live in a time when there really is a crisis of suicide, especially among young people. If you ever hear any sign, hear any word, see any sign, suicidal ideation, take it very seriously. Encourage, help the people to get any support that they need. You know, it just felt so, you know, perhaps hearing that story can help save someone else. That's all I can say. And I'll repeat something I've said many times before. If you ever have an opportunity, and I call it an opportunity, to attend a funeral, to attend a house of mourning, go. It's so important to the community that you're there. And even for yourself, the spiritual lessons that you learn in that context are of the most profound variety. All right, let's get going. As I said, there's a lot to do with this double daf. We are doing pages 29 and 30 today in Tractate Rosh Hashana, the 9th volume of the Talmud. We're going to be completing chapter 3 and opening chapter 4. This volume has 35 pages in it, so we're really approaching the end of Tractate Rosh Hashana, and we'll be making a siyum. I believe Shabbos is the last day, right? Today's Monday, and we're getting through 30. So 1 on Tuesday, 2 on Wednesday, 3 on Thursday, 4 on Friday, 5 on Saturday. So Saturday night, with God's help, we'll be making a siyum. What a perfect time. The clocks have turned back. We should be able to get on the air, like by 7 p.m. On Saturday, and we'll gather and celebrate and make a l'chaim and have something to make a bracha over. Saturday night siyum on tractate Rosh Hashana. And then I think we begin tractate Tanis next. Yeah. Tractate Tanis is next. Okay. Where are we? So we pick it up at the very bottom of page 28 on the B side. Excuse me. With regard to the intent required in order to fulfill the mitzvah of shofar. We started to talk about this on Saturday night. Is intent required in order to fulfill a mitzvah? And we saw that there was a passionate and long-lasting debate about this among the sages, but ultimately the law follows Rabbi Zera, and one does require intent, although we can assume that intent from certain kinds of behavior. It doesn't have to be completely specific, but the ideal way to perform any mitzvah is to know that you're performing it and be performing it on purpose. And with many mitzvahs, by Torah law, if you don't have that intent to fulfill the mitzvah, you will not have fulfilled your obligation. With regard to the intent required to fulfill the mitzvah of shofar, Rabbi Zera said to his servant, "Have intent to sound the shofar on my behalf and sound it for me." And the Gemara infers, apparently Rabbi Zera maintains that he who sounds the shofar. Now, we've been talking about having an intent to hear the shofar. It's a mitzvah to hear the shofar on Rosh Hashana. And you can't accidentally hear the shofar, not know you're listening to the shofar, and then later say, oh yeah, I did hear the shofar. Okay, well, I fulfilled my obligation. You have to know you're hearing the shofar and say, okay, good, I'm fulfilling the mitzvah of shofar in order to fulfill your obligation. But what about the one who is blasting the shofar? What intent does he have to have? He has to have an intent to be blowing the shofar and not just making sounds. But do we have to have this matchup that the guy who's sounding the shofar is intending to sound the shofar for a person, and the one who's listening has to have that intent to be listening, right? So Rabbi Zera said to his attendant, have intent to sound the shofar on my behalf and sound it for me. And the Gemara infers, apparently Rabbi Zera maintains that he who sounds the shofar, he who blasts the shofar for others, is required to have intent in order for the hearer, the listener of the shofar, to discharge his obligation, to fulfill his obligation. And the Gemara raises an objection from the Mishna. We read, if one was passing behind a synagogue or his house was adjacent to the synagogue, and he heard the sound of the shofar or the sound of the Megillah on Purim, the book of Esther being read, if he focused his heart to fulfill his obligation, he happened to hear it, so then he has to focus his heart and say, I'm listening to it, yes, I'm fulfilling my obligation, then he has fulfilled his obligation. But if he doesn't focus his heart on it, then even though he heard it, since he's not forming an intent to fulfill his obligation, then he has not fulfilled his obligation. So that was our Mishnah, and now we're applying that Mishnah to this incident where Rabbi Zera asked his attendant to form an intent to sound the shofar for me, Rabbi Zera, and I will have an intent to fulfill my obligation as I listen to it. And so it may be asked, and according to Rabbi Zera, even if the hearer, the one who's incidentally walking by the synagogue, focuses his heart on fulfilling his obligation as he listens to the shofar, what of it? The other one, the one blasting the shofar inside the synagogue, he certainly did not focus his intent to sound the shofar with this person in mind who happened to be walking behind the synagogue at the time that the shofar was being blown inside. So if indeed the intent of the one blasting the shofar is also required, how does that passerby fulfill his obligation? And the Gemara answers, here we are dealing with the representative of the community, i.e., one who sounds the shofar for the entire congregation and has everyone in mind. He does not sound it for a specific individual, but rather on behalf of the entire community, and therefore anyone who hears him sound the shofar fulfills his obligation. But what we're learning here from the incident of Rabbi Zera is that when somebody sounds a shofar for an individual, and I told you that story when I was in Uman for Rosh Hashana, and somebody had missed hearing the shofar, and I said, could somebody sound it for me? And I stepped in because I had a shofar, and I tried to sound all 100 blasts. I needed some help once we got to the later ones. But there, I was blowing the shofar for an individual to listen to it, not for the whole community. And in that situation, he will not have fulfilled his obligation unless I have an intent to to blast the shofar for him so he can fulfill his obligation. And it makes sense. Where would this matter? If somebody's just blowing the shofar not for the needs of the community, but sort of just practicing the shofar blast, and some other person happens to be walking by and hears that, has he fulfilled his obligation? No, because that's a one-on-one shofar situation, and here the one who's just practicing the shofar doesn't have a specific intent to help that other listener fulfill his obligation, and so he has not fulfilled his obligation. Indeed, the halacha, one who sounds the shofar for an individual must have intent to discharge his obligation. If one is sounding the shofar for a congregation, it is assumed that he has intent to discharge the obligation of anyone who hears him sounding the shofar. Therefore, if one passes by the synagogue or is sitting in his house, which is the neighboring house to the synagogue, and he hears the sounding of the representative of the community, if that person then forms an intent to fulfill his obligation, he has fulfilled it. That concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 4 here in chapter 3. We move on to Mishnah number 5. Incidental to the discussion of the required intent when sounding the shofar, the Mishnah cites the verse Exodus 17:11, and it came to pass when Moses held up his hand that Israel prevailed, and when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. This was the incident when the children of Israel are in the wilderness after the departure from Egypt, and they have a war with Amalek, a very difficult battle. And it happened that Moses was watching the battle from a hilltop with, I think, Joshua, and I'm not sure who was on the other side of him. Maybe it was Joshua and Aaron. And that when he was lifting up his arms, the army of Israel was prevailing in the battle. And when Moses' hands were down, the army started losing the battle. And so they helped him. They sat him down on a rock and they held up his arms. With regard to that incident, it may be asked, did the hands of Moses make war when he raised them, or break war when he lowered them? Right? Was he making war with his arms? I mean, clearly he wasn't, in the battle killing Amalekites. Is it some kind of magic that when his arms are up, we win the war? Is it some kind of direct communication from God that as long as Moses can keep his arms up in the air, God is going to step in and defeat the Amalekites. But if Moses gets tired, God will not step in? Say our sages, no, that was not what was happening. Rather, the verse comes to tell you that as long as the Jewish people turned their eyes upward and subjected their hearts to their Father in heaven, they prevailed. But if not, they fell. Similarly, you can say, the verse states at Numbers 21, verse 8, make for yourself a fiery serpent and set it upon a pole, and it shall come to pass that everyone that is bitten, when he sees it, he shall live. This was an incident where the children of Israel had angered God, and he sent, some heavenly punishment to the people that killed many. And then God instructed Moses to, in order to fight back against this plague, that he would make a copper serpent on top of a pole. And when the people looked at that copper serpent on the pole, they would be saved from the plague that was attacking them. And from this, I'm pretty sure we get the symbol, the medical symbol, right, of the snakes kind of intertwined. How did snakes become the symbol of medicine? It's from this incident. And once again, it may be asked, did the serpent kill or did the serpent preserve life? It's a copper serpent. Rather, when the Jewish people turned their eyes upward and subjected their hearts to their Father in heaven, they were healed. But if not, they rotted from their snake bites. Now, you may say, well, wait a minute, there's been many times in history when the Jews were really up against the wall and they all prayed to their Father in heaven and they were not saved. Right? The Holocaust comes to mind immediately. So what's going on here? And you could say, well, that was special circumstances when the children of Israel were all in one place. All the children of Israel that existed were in the wilderness at that time. And when they, as a people, turned their eyes heavenward, they were saved. And since then, we've never been so united. There's been many times in history where we were persecuted, but you can't say that all of the people during those times of persecution looked to God for assistance. Many individuals did, but not the entire people, sadly. Returning to its halachic discussion, the Mishnah continues with regard to intent. That's what we're talking about. That's why we went into that little digression about Moses' arms being in the air or the copper serpent being elevated and the people, looking there with great faith and expecting God to intercede on their behalf, and those prayers were answered. But now we're generally talking about intent to perform a mitzvah. So returning to our discussion of Jewish law, the Mishnah continues, a deaf mute, an imbecile, or a minor who sounds the shofar cannot discharge the obligation on behalf of the community. And this is the principle with regard to similar matters. Whoever is not obligated to do a certain matter cannot discharge the obligation on behalf of the community. So these three groups often get brought up as examples of people who are not obligated in particular mitzvahs. The deaf mute, we really hate to hear that for our modern ear, but in the ancient world, they didn't have the resources available to help a deaf mute interact with the community. And it was understood back then that they were not capable of understanding exactly what was required of them, since nobody could speak and explain it to them, nor could they communicate what they had understood through writing or signs or whatever. Since they couldn't communicate effectively, they weren't obligated in mitzvahs. They were certainly welcome to perform them, but they weren't obligated. Likewise, the word is an imbecile in the English translation, but somebody who's just incapable of the cognitive ability to understand their obligations, and a minor who is not an adult yet and therefore not obligated in the mitzvahs. And since they are not obligated, they won't be able to perform a mitzvah that others rely on to fulfill their obligation, like blasting the shofar. The one who is not obligated in hearing the shofar cannot blast the shofar for others. That's the principle we're learning. That's Mishnah number 5. The Gemara. The sages taught the following baraisa. All are obligated to sound the shofar. Right, so all are obligated in blasting the shofar. Now, it doesn't mean that every person has to blast the shofar, but since all are obligated to listen to it, these people are also obligated in blasting it, meaning that they can blast it and allow others to fulfill their obligation by listening. Which groups? Kohanim, Leviim, and Israelites, right? So that's basically all the Jewish men, right? So either you're a priest, a Kohen, or you're a Levite, a Levi, I'm a Levi, or you're an Israel, a Yisrael, right? That's everybody else. So in other words, either you're the special group or the descendants of Aaron, and you're a priest, a Kohen, or you're a descendant of Levi and the tribe of Levi, or you're just a Jew of all the rest of the Jews. as well as converts, freed slaves, a tomb. That's very interesting. We haven't, I don't know that in our journey up until now in Volume 9 of the Talmud, we've mentioned this. This will come up quite a bit over the course of our journey through the whole Talmud. For the sages of the Talmud, there are 4 genders, right? There's male and there's female, and then there's tomb and androgynos. So a tomb is one whose sexual organs from birth are concealed or are so undeveloped that it is impossible to determine whether the individual is a male or a female. The 4th kind is an androgynos, also called or translated as a hermaphrodite, meaning somebody who has sexual organs of both genders. So a tomb is neither male nor female, and an androgynos is both male and female. Obviously, those 2 situations are very rare, very infrequent, but as often happens in the Talmud, because they present interesting halakhic legal questions, they get referenced quite a bit, because what do we do in those liminal areas? That's where we really come to understand what the law is when we test it in the difficult areas. That's why the Talmud is always interested in very difficult borderline cases. Okay, so the point here is that priests, Levites, ordinary Israelites, converts, freed slaves, the tomb, and the androgynos are all obligated in the sound to sound the shofar. Therefore, they can sound it for others, as well as somebody who is half slave, half free, meaning a person who is owned by 2 owners, a slave that's owned by 2 owners, but one of the owners frees him. That person is now half free from the half owner that freed him, but still half slave because he still has that other owner who has not freed him. A tomb who sounds the shofar cannot discharge the obligation of one of his kind, a fellow tomb, since men are bound by the obligation, whereas women are not. And women are not obligated to hear shofar, although the custom certainly has become that women listen to the shofar and can even say a blessing on hearing the shofar. But because it's a time-bound positive commandment, women are technically not obligated in it. So where am I? So the tomb, since men are bound by the obligation, whereas women are not, and it is possible that the blaster is female and the listener is male, nor can he discharge the obligation of one who is not of his kind, an ordinary man or woman. A hermaphrodite can discharge the obligation of one of his kind, a fellow hermaphrodite, or androgynos in Hebrew, since if the sounder is treated as a female, the hearer is also considered a female, but he cannot discharge the obligation of one who is not of his kind. One who is half slave and half free cannot discharge the obligation of one of his kind, as the slave component of the blaster cannot discharge the obligation of the free component of the listener. And he certainly cannot discharge the obligation of one who is not of his kind, i.e. a completely free individual. And the master said above in the Baraisa, all are obligated in the sound to blast the shofar, and therefore can blast it, and others can fulfill their obligation by listening to it. Including priests, Levites, and ordinary Israelites. And the Gemara asks in astonishment, isn't that obvious? If these people are not obligated to perform the mitzvah, who then is obligated to perform it? I mean, if it wouldn't be them, who's left? It's like that's the vast majority of everybody. And the Gemara answers, it was necessary to say that priests are obligated to fulfill the mitzvah, for it might enter your mind to say as follows, since it is written, Numbers 29:1, it is a day of blasting the shofar to you. You might have said that with regard to one who is obligated to blast only one day of the year, he is obligated to blast the shofar on Rosh Hashana. But with regard to these priests, since they are obligated to blast all year long because they blast trumpets whenever they offer the sacrifices in the temple, as it is written, and you shall blast the trumpets over your burnt offerings and over the sacrifices of your peace offerings, Numbers 10:10, you might say that they, the priests, are not obligated to blast the shofar on Rosh Hashana. And therefore the Baraisa comes to teach us that this is not true and that even priests are obligated to fulfill the mitzvah. And the Gemara asks, are these things comparable? There, the priests blast trumpets every day with the daily offerings. And here we are dealing with blasting of the shofar. Rather, it was necessary to say that priests are obligated to fulfill the mitzvah for a different reason. For it may enter your mind to say as follows, since we learned in the Mishna, Yom Kippur, the Jubilee year, is the same as Rosh Hashana with regard to both the shofar blasts and the additional blessings that are recited in the Amidah, the standing prayer. I might have said, one who is fully included in the mitzvah of the Jubilee is also included in the mitzvah of Rosh Hashanah, but these priests, since they are not fully included in the mitzvah of the Jubilee, as we learned in the Mishnah, priests and Levites may sell their fields forever, and they may also redeem their lands forever, and they are not bound by the laws of the Jubilee year, right? Because the Levites, and priests are a subset of the Levites, did not receive land in the Holy Land when it was apportioned to all the tribes. The Levites were given to live in the cities and receive the tithe, but they weren't giving ancestral inheritance of land. And therefore, they're not able to participate in that aspect of the Jubilee year. So you might have thought, since the shofar blast is such an important part of observing the Jubilee year, and they're not included in that therefore they're also not obligated in blasting the shofar, and therefore when they blast the shofar, other people do not fulfill their obligation by listening to it. You might have thought that, but the Baraisa comes to tell us, no, priests and Levites are obligated just like any other Israelite. And that's what it said. So halachas here. Where did the law end up out of this discussion? So anyone who is inherently not obligated to fulfill a mitzvah, as opposed to one who is no longer under obligation because he has already fulfilled it, cannot discharge the obligation of others. Therefore, a deaf, mute, an imbecile, or a minor cannot discharge the obligation of others, since they are not obligated. One should be stringent with regard to a child who has reached the age of maturity, but it is unclear whether he has developed physical signs of maturity. A deaf person who speaks but does not hear cannot discharge the obligation of others, even though he is considered to have awareness, since he is not obligated to hear the shofar, since he cannot hear it. However, some authorities require him to sound it for himself without a blessing. A mute person who hears but does not speak can discharge the obligation of others, according to the Rima, and he can sound the shofar even ab initio, even though he cannot recite the blessings because he's mute. A deaf person who hears with the help of a hearing device is obligated to hear the shofar. So there you have a ruling that is a more recent ruling than what was available to the sages in their day. We skip down just a little bit. Continuing the discussion of performing an obligation on behalf of others. Ahava, the son of Rabbi Zera, taught the following baraisa. With regard to all the blessings, even if one already recited a blessing for himself and has consequently fulfilled his own obligation, he can still recite a blessing for others and thereby discharge their obligation, as all Jews are responsible for one another. Right? So if somebody, for example, we're eating bread, right? If we're gonna eat a meal, and it's a meal by definition because we're gonna eat bread in it. So at the beginning of the meal, we're gonna have to wash our hands and say a blessing over washing our hands, and then we're gonna come to the table without talking, and then we're gonna say a blessing over the bread, and then we eat some of the bread, and then we can go on and enjoy the rest of the meal. And afterwards, we'll have to bench. We'll have to say the grace after the meals because it was a meal because it included bread. When we say the blessing over the bread, it's not that I say a blessing over my bread and you say a blessing over your bread and then only then can we eat. It's enough if I say a blessing over the bread and you say Amen, then it's as if I had intent to recite that blessing for both of us. You show that you agreed that I said the blessing for both of us by saying Amen to it. And then I have fulfilled your obligation or helped you fulfill your obligation to say the blessing before the meal over the bread, right? So I can say a blessing that discharges you from saying it. You have fulfilled your obligation by listening to me say the blessing over the bread for both of us. That's the situation we're talking about. And this is true with regard to all blessings, except for the blessing recited over bread and the blessing recited over wine, both before and after their consumption. With regard to these blessings, if he has not yet fulfilled his own obligation, he can discharge the obligation of others as well. If I have not yet eaten bread and you have not yet eaten bread, I can say the blessing for both of us, then you say amen, and then we both eat some bread, and now we both discharge the obligation to say that blessing before eating it because I said it. However, if I washed my hands, I came to the table, I said the blessing over bread, and then I ate some bread, and then you come over, and for some reason you can't say that blessing for yourself, can I say it for you? No, because I've already said the blessing and eaten the bread. I can't make that blessing again on your behalf. Why? But if he has already fulfilled his own obligation, he cannot discharge the obligation of others. Why? As these blessings are recited in appreciation of physical enjoyment and can only be recited by one who is actually deriving pleasure at the time. I might continue eating bread during the meal, but I've already said the blessing in appreciation for the bread, and I can't say it again, even if it's for you. Rava raised a dilemma. With regard to the blessing over bread that is recited before eating matzah at the Passover Seder, and the blessing over wine that is recited as part of the sanctification of the day, of Shabbos, or a festival. What is the law? Now the Gemara analyzes the question. Do we say that since there is an obligation to recite these blessings due to the mitzvah involved, you're not obligated to eat bread at any meal? You're not obligated to eat bread at any meal, but you are obligated to eat matzah at Passover, and you are obligated to make a kiddush over wine, or can actually be done over other substances, but you must sanctify the day. That is an obligation for Shabbos or for a holiday, for a festival. So, since there is an obligation to recite these blessings due to the mitzvah involved, therefore one can discharge the obligation for others even if he himself has already fulfilled his obligation. Question. Or perhaps we say that the blessing itself is not an obligation, but rather the obligation lies in the eating and drinking, and the blessing recited over one's physical enjoyment, and therefore, if he already fulfilled his own obligation, he cannot recite the blessing for others, as he derives no pleasure at the time. So with regard to the Kiddush and matzah at Pesach, if I've already made Kiddush and had some wine for myself, or if I've already made a motzi and had some matzah at Passover, can I then recite that blessing for somebody else so they could fulfill their obligation? Gemara answers, come in here and answer to this question from what Rav Ashi said. When we were studying in the school of Rav Papi, he would recite Kiddush for us, and when his tenants would arrive from the field, he would recite Kiddush once again on their behalf. They could have recited it for themselves, but they wanted to have the Kiddush recited for them by the great sage. Therefore, it is clear that one may recite Kiddush on behalf of others, including the blessing that is recited over wine, even if he himself has already fulfilled his own obligation. And the sages taught in a Baraisa, one should not break bread and recite a blessing for guests unless he is eating with them, so that he is obligated to recite the blessing for himself. But he may break bread for his children and for the other members of his household and recite the blessing in order to educate them to perform the mitzvahs so that they should know how to recite a blessing. And with regard to Hallel and the Megillah that we read at Purim, the law is that even if he has already fulfilled his obligation, he can still discharge the obligation of others. And what is the law on this? Even if one is not eating matzah himself, he may recite the blessing, who brings forth bread from the earth, the motzi blessing, the bread blessing, over the matzah in order to discharge the obligations of others. Similarly, one who is not partaking of the meal may recite the blessing over the wine of Kiddush on Shabbos, according to Rav Ashi's conclusion. So you can do it matzah at Passover or wine Kiddush on any Shabbos or festival, because there's an obligation to do that for the day. So even if you've already done it for yourself, you could do it for someone else. But if I've already made a blessing over bread, even on Friday night, not the Kiddush, you can make Kiddush over bread, but if you're just making a motzi over the bread, and you've already done that for yourself, you can't then do it for someone else because you already did it, and it's too late to do that for someone else. And again, further explaining that law, one who is not eating is prohibited from reciting enjoyment blessings for others, even if they do not know how to recite the blessing themselves. However, he can recite the blessing for children, even if they are not of his household, in order to educate them to perform mitzvahs. That concludes our discussion of chapter 3. And now we move to chapter 4. We're near the end of the B side of page 29. Mishnah number 1 of chapter 4. With regard to the festival day of Rosh Hashana that occurs on Shabbos, in the temple they would sound the shofar as usual. However, they would not sound it in the rest of the country, outside the temple. After the temple was destroyed, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted that the people should sound the shofar on Shabbos in every place where there is a court of 23 judges. Rabbi Elazar said, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted this practice only in Yavne, where the great Sanhedrin of 71 judges resided in his time, but nowhere else. And they said to him, he instituted the practice both in Yavne and in any place where there is a court. And the Mishnah adds, and Jerusalem in earlier times had this additional superiority over Yavne after Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted this practice. For in any city whose residents could see Jerusalem and hear the sounding of the shofar from there, and which was near to Jerusalem, and people could come to Jerusalem from there, in those cities they would sound the shofar there as well, as it was considered part of Jerusalem. But in Yavne, they would sound the shofar only in the court itself and not in the surrounding cities, even if they were close and could hear the shofar being sounded in Yavne. That's Mishnah number 1 of chapter 4. The Gemara asks, from where are these matters derived? From where is it derived that the shofar is not sounded on Shabbos? Rabbi Levi bar Lachma said that Rabbi Chama bar Chanina said, at one verse says, with regard to Rosh Hashana, Leviticus 23:24, a solemn rest, a memorial of blasts, which indicates that one should merely remember the shofar without actually sounding it. And another verse says, at Numbers 29:1, it is a day of blasting for you, a day on which one must actually blast the shofar. Now, this apparent contradiction is not difficult. Here, the verse in which the shofar is only being remembered but not blasted is referring to Rosh Hashanah that occurs on Shabbos. There, the verse in which the shofar is actually blasted is referring to a Rosh Hashanah that occurs on any other day, on a weekday. Rava said, by Torah law, I just skipped a couple paragraphs. Rava said, by Torah law, one is permitted to sound the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, even on Shabbos. And it was the sages who decreed that it is prohibited. And this is in accordance with the opinion of Rava. As Rava said, all are obligated to blast the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, but not all are experts in blasting the shofar. And therefore, the sages instituted a decree that the shofar should not be blasted on Shabbos, lest one take the shofar in his hand and go to an expert to learn how to sound it, to blast it, or to have that expert blast it for him. And due to his preoccupation that he wants to hear the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, he might not remember that he's not allowed to carry in the public domain, just like on Shabbos, because it's Shabbos, and he might carry it 4 cubits in the public domain, which is a desecration of Shabbos. And the Gemara comments, and this is also the reason for the rabbinical decree that the palm branch, the lulav, may not be taken on Shabbos. In other words, on Sukkot, we have an obligation to take the lulav, but we don't do it on Shabbos. And this is likewise the reason for the decree that the Megillah of Esther, the scroll of Esther, is not read on Shabbos. I think that the calendar's been arranged so that Purim never falls on Shabbos, so we always read the Megillah on Purim. But if Purim fell on Shabbos, we wouldn't read the Megillah. The sages were concerned that one might carry the lulav or the Megillah 4 cubits in the public domain to take it to an expert who will teach him the proper manner to perform these mitzvahs. And then he would have desecrated Shabbos by carrying more than 4 cubits in the public domain. And the Mishnah taught, after the temple was destroyed, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted that the people should blast the shofar on Shabbos in every place where there is a court of 23 judges. Not just every place, only those places where there's a major court, a court of 23 judges, right? You can have a rabbinic court with only 3 judges. A court of 23 judges is a very hefty matter, such a court. So very few places in the world would have a court of 23 judges. Only there is it permitted to blast the shofar on Rosh Hashana that falls on Shabbos. And the background to this decree is related in greater detail in a baraisa. I keep saying baraisa if anyone's not familiar. A baraisa is contemporaneous with a Mishna, but not quite as authoritative, but they're mentioned all the time in our Gemara, our commentary on the Mishnah, to help us understand the Mishnah. So the background to this decree is related in greater detail in a baraisa. As the sages taught, once Rosh Hashana occurred on Shabbos, and all the cities gathered at the Great Sanhedrin in Yavne. The Great Sanhedrin, which normally met in Jerusalem while the temple was standing after the second temple was destroyed, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai secured permission from the Romans to move the Sanhedrin and the sages to the little town of Yavne, and that would be the rabbinic center of Judaism for some time until other centers of learning would be established. After the temple was destroyed, after the second temple was destroyed. So, once Rosh Hashanah occurred on Shabbos, and all the cities gathered at the Great Sanhedrin in Yavne for the festival prayers. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said to the sons of Betera, who were the leading halakhic authorities of that generation, let us sound the shofar just as it was sounded when the temple was standing. And they said to him, whoa, let us discuss whether or not this is permitted. And he said to them, well, first let us sound it, and afterwards, when there is time, let us discuss the matter. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was saying, well, this could be a long discussion. Everybody has to weigh in, lots of back and forth, and by the time we're finished discussing it, Rosh Hashanah might have ended, and the shofar never got sounded. So let's just sound it, right? It's not like we're saying we're going to sound it everywhere that Jews live on Shabbos. It was when the temple was standing, it was only blown in Jerusalem, in the temple on Shabbos, elsewhere not, unless it was just very close to Jerusalem. Now that we've sort of reestablished the Sanhedrin in Yavne, so we should blast the shofar even when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos, just as we did when the temple was standing. And the sages at that time, the sons of Betera, said, we got to talk about that. He says, we don't have time to talk it all the way through. Let's just sound it, because it may well be that we will conclude that we're obligated, and then we would have missed our opportunity. So let's just sound it. So they did, since Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was the in charge of things at that time. After they sounded the shofar, the sons of Betera said to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, okay, now let's discuss the issue. And he said to them, the horn has already been heard in Yavne, and one does not refute a ruling after the action has already been taken. There is no point in discussing the matter, as it would be inappropriate to say that the community acted erroneously after the fact. This was a Talmudic example of better to seek forgiveness than permission, right? Let's just do it and get forgiveness after we did wrong, but let's make sure it gets done. And it got done. Skip a couple paragraphs. The Mishnah taught that they said to him, he instituted the practice both in Yavne and in any place where there is a court. And Rav Huna said, and they would sound the shofar on Shabbos with the court. And Rav Huna's brief statement is obscure, and therefore the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of the phrase with the court? It means in the presence of the court, i.e. in the place where the court convenes. And this comes to exclude any place that is not in the presence of the court, as the shofar is not sounded there. So it's not just that we can only sound the shofar on Rosh Hashanah that falls on Shabbos in a city that has a rabbinic court of at least 23 judges. It doesn't mean that, okay, if we have such a court in the city, we can blow shofars all around the city. Rather, we only blow the shofar in the presence of the judges of that court. Okay, and now we're skipping a whole bunch, and we're actually going to go to Mishnah number 2. Mishnah number 2. I'm near the bottom of the A side, or quite a way down on the A side of page 30. And we're doing 2 pages today, but we're doing much less of page 30, so we won't finish. It won't be an overlong class. Mishnah number 2. After the previous Mishnah mentioned that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's ordinance that applies to the sounding of the shofar, this Mishnah records other ordinances instituted by the same sage. At first, during the temple era, the lulav was taken in the temple all 7 days of Sukkot, and in the rest of the country outside the temple, it was only taken 1 day, on the first day of the festival. After the temple was destroyed, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted that the lulav should be taken even in the rest of the country all 7 days. Why? In commemoration of the temple. The temple's no longer with us, so we are going to wave the lulav all 7 days in commemoration of the temple, though not on Shabbos. And for similar reasons, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted that for the entire day of waving the Omer offering, which is done on the second day of Passover, which is the 16th of Nisan, eating the grain of the new crop is prohibited. You can't eat the grain of the new crop until the Omer offering has been brought in the temple on the second day of Passover. By Torah law, when the temple is standing, the new grain may not be eaten until after the Omer offering is brought in the temple on the 16th of Nisan, usually early in the morning. When the temple is not standing, it may be eaten from the time that the eastern horizon is illuminated at daybreak. However, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted a prohibition against eating the new grain throughout the entire 16th of Nisan, and you can't eat from the new grain until the next day, the third day of Passover, which is the 17th of Nisan. Why? To commemorate the temple. And the Gemara asks, now we're in the Gemara, and from where do we derive that one performs actions in commemoration of the temple? Why should we be commemorating the temple? How do we know that we're supposed to do that? As the verse states, for I will restore health. This is Jeremiah 30:17. For I will restore health to you, and I will heal you of your wounds, said the Lord, because they have called you an outcast. She is Zion. There is none who care for her. And this verse teaches by inference that Jerusalem requires caring through acts of commemoration. From this verse in Jeremiah, we understand that we must long for the temple, right? We must long for the Messiah to come and rebuild the temple. And as long as that temple is not rebuilt, we need to long for it, and we need to do actions which commemorate the temple. For example, we break a glass at a wedding. Why? Because we commemorate the temple. We, even in our highest joy, which is a wedding, we remember that our joy is not complete because the temple is not yet restored to us. And therefore we break that glass as a commemoration of the temple. What's the source for that? This verse from Jeremiah. And the Mishnah taught, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai also instituted that for the entire day of waving the Omer offering, eating the grain of the new crop is prohibited. And the Gemara asks, what is the reason for this ordinance? The reasoning is that soon the temple will be rebuilt. And people will say, last year, when the temple was in ruins, didn't we eat from the new crop as soon as the eastern horizon was illuminated on the morning of the 16th of Nisan, as the new crop was permitted immediately? Now, too, let us eat the new grain at that time. And they do not know that last year, when there was no Omer offering brought because the temple was in ruins, the eastern horizon illuminating, i.e. the morning of the 16th of Nisan, did serve to permit the consumption of the new grain immediately. However, now that the temple has been rebuilt and there is an Omer offering to be brought in the temple, it is only the offering of the Omer offering on the morning of the 16th that permits the consumption of the new grain. Therefore, as soon as the sun appears in the sky, it does not permit us to eat it, and people may come to eat the Omer, the grain of the new crop too early and commit a transgression. Therefore, Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted that you can eat grain from the new offering as long as the temple is destroyed. You can't eat it all day on the 16th, so that people don't make a mistake when the Messiah comes and the temple goes up all in one day, and then we have it, just so they don't make that mistake, because they become so used to eating the new grain as soon as the sun appears on the 16th. Skip a bunch of paragraphs. We're on the B side of page 30. It is taught in the Mishnah, instituted. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted. Did he just create rabbinic ordinances that we have to follow? The term is referring to a rabbinic ordinance, instituted, not a Torah law. But it seems like we've been talking about this as a Torah law that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is talking about. What is the meaning of the term instituted? It means that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai interpreted the verse and instituted that this is how one should act from now onward. When the temple was standing, there was no need for this halacha, as it was permitted to eat the new grain after sacrificing the Omer. But it is by Torah law that when there is no temple, you could just eat it on the 16th as soon as the sun rises. Rabbi Yochanan instituted that we don't do that, but he was helping us understand what the Torah law says, not creating rabbinic decrees. Now we go to Mishnah number 3, and I'm almost done. We're just going to read this Mishnah and then go to questions and comments. Mishnah number 3 of chapter 4. Initially, they would accept testimony to determine the start of the month throughout the entire 30th day from the beginning of the month of Elul before Rosh Hashanah. And if witnesses arrived from afar and testified that they had sighted the new moon the previous night, they would declare that day the festival, right? In other words, remember that when Elul is a standard month, 29 days long, then Rosh Hashanah is the 30th day from the first day of Elul, and that's when is the first of Tishrei, and we celebrate Rosh Hashanah. But they don't know whether it's Rosh Hashanah until those witnesses come in to testify before the Sanhedrin. So it's funny, like you don't know it's Rosh Hashanah until the witnesses come and testify on that morning, which is going to become the day of Rosh Hashanah. But what if not? What if it was difficult to see the moon? Right now, if you couldn't see it at all, then Rosh Hashanah is going to be delayed a day, right? Because there was no testimony. But what if the witnesses do come, but they come late, like really late, like when it's almost nighttime? Then it's like the whole day of Rosh Hashanah is basically over before we even found out that it was Rosh Hashanah. And that was legal. That it could be done that way. So that's why they instituted that. Well, wait a minute. That's no good. We can't have witnesses come right before, nightfall on the day that actually is Rosh Hashanah. And we actually missed almost all of Rosh Hashanah. So the sages instituted that they would accept testimony to determine the start of the new month of Tishrei, therefore Rosh Hashanah, only until Mincha, the time of the afternoon prayer, shortly after midday. If witnesses had not arrived by that hour, they would declare Elul a 30-day month and calculate the dates of the festivals accordingly. Rosh Hashanah would fall on the 31st day from the beginning of Elul. And if witnesses came from Mincha time onward, although the calculations for the dates of the festivals would begin the following day, the people would nevertheless observe that day on which the witnesses arrived as sacred, so that in future years they would not treat the entire day as a weekday and engage in labor from the morning on the assumption that the witnesses will arrive only after Mincha. And that's how they generally ended up with a 2-day Rosh Hashanah, even in Jerusalem. And they would also observe the following day as sacred. On the second day, they observed Rosh Hashanah in full, both by sacrificing its offerings as well as by calculating the upcoming festivals from that date. but they didn't do work and treated it as a sacred day on the first day as well. After the temple was destroyed and there was no longer any reason for this ordinance, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted that they would once again accept testimony to determine the start of the month the entire day, as long as it was still daylight, even in the late afternoon. Okay, that's where we are. Nina went to the Shiva call at the House of Mourning, so she's not passing me questions. So bear with me as I scan the comments to see if I can find the questions. Reload. Come on, Facebook. Reload. There we go. Okay. Okay, so Bill is telling me that we don't get the caduceus, the two snakes, winged staff of the U.S. medical symbol only, or the Asclepius rod, one snake, no wings. U.S. ambulances and general medical symbol worldwide. We don't tie it directly to the brazen or the bronze, okay, the brazen serpent of Moses. We get them from pagan Greek symbols for doctors. But the Asclepius survived as a symbol of health after Christianity displaced Greek paganism because it looked enough like the brazen serpent to pass muster. Why we use the caduceus instead of the Asclepius is a long story for another time. Thank you, Bill. That's what I mentioned before, the copper serpent related to the medical symbol, related, not the derivation, as Bill has just told us. Tom Beck, I find it almost impossible to understand anything about God and the Holocaust. And that's basically, I would say, the correct understanding. We can't understand it, and we certainly can't explain it. As I mentioned before, for me personally, the only way that I can, get my head around it at all is to remind myself that we are eternal souls, right? And so no matter how terrible the suffering endured by any person in this world, it's very quick compared to the life of an eternal soul. And only when we return to the world of souls would it even be possible to discuss such questions at what God had in mind with all the terrible suffering that went on in this world. We can't understand it while we're here. We can't. I just have faith that God has a reason and that we may be able to understand it once we return to our own identity as souls in the world of souls. Sharon reminding me it was Aaron and Hur. Joshua was leading the soldiers in the battle. Thank you. When we're talking about Moses' arms in the air during the battle with the Amalekites, Joshua was leading the soldiers on the battlefield, and it was Aaron and Hur who were helping extend Moses' arms upward. But the key is that wasn't some kind of magic gesture that we didn't even need to send the soldiers onto the battlefield. If all we needed was Moses to keep his arms in the air and then the Amalekites lose, why risk any lives at all? But the teaching there was when the Jewish people as a whole turn their eyes heavenward and submit their hearts to God in heaven, then they prevail. And when they don't, we don't, right? Tom, I wonder if the Tanaim, the rabbis of the Mishna, and the Amoraim, the rabbis of the Gemara, could have imagined that people would be studying their words thousands of years later. I'm going to say they could. They could. And the only reason I'm saying that is because they were already participating in a tradition that was 1,500 years old, 1,500 even to 2,000 years old at the time that they were adding to it. So why not imagine that it would continue for another, 1,500 or 2,000 years? Perhaps what they hoped in their heart of hearts, that just as the second temple came, but 70 years after the destruction of the first temple, perhaps they thought that the exile which followed the destruction of the second temple, would last 70 years, 100 years, I'm sorry, I got something in my eye. 200 years, but could it possibly last going on 2,000 years? I think they wouldn't permit themselves to believe that. Alas, here we are, still longing for Mashiach, for the Messiah to come, and for the rebuilding of the third temple. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow for page 31 here in Tractate Rosh Hashana. Have a great evening.